Hey guys, this video will focus on the weaknesses of the budget or budgetary policy to achieve domestic economic stability. Now there are 6 major weaknesses in budgetary policy in achieving domestic economic stability, and domestic economic stability being the achievement of 3 goals: low inflation, full employment, and strong growth. So we're going to look at the weaknesses of the budget in achieving these 3 economic goals. So firstly, we have what is known as this constraint of long time lags. And this especially is the case when discretionary measures are used to counter-cyclically stabilize economic activity. So in times of, say, recession or trough, we will see that the budget would actually implement discretionary policies to complement automatic stabilizers to slow or to improve economic growth. So this is in times of a low economic activity. And one of the major government policies to increase growth is construction. So the government will decide to build roads, buildings, public transport systems, and all these different types of construction in order to encourage growth. So when we start building more or investing more, then therefore we will start employing more workers, and therefore incomes will increase as per the circular flow. And so we will move out of this period of low economic growth. So that's all well and good in theory, but in reality we have this idea that it may take time to actually pass, say, construction plans through local governments. So the government can't just start building or constructing buildings, roads, and public transport anywhere they want. They need to pass it through local governments, they need to pass it through legislation, and they need to pass it through respective local and state laws. And so this takes time, and as we know, the business cycle operates irrespective of or irregardless of the budget, and therefore sometimes we have what is known as this movement away from this trough, and this would in fact, the economic growth would in fact increase to the steady rate over time. And it takes, say this is year 3, this is year 4, and it takes 1 year for this legislation or this council work to be approved. And so instead of being counter-cyclical, they may become pro-cyclical. And this is detrimental to both the achievement of sustainable economic growth, sustainable inflation rates, and full employment, because when it becomes pro-cyclical, there would be, in fact, excessive aggregate demand. So in this case, the government wanted the buildings to be approved at this point here, but in fact, in reality, they may have been approved at this point here, and this would further stimulate economic growth to an unsustainable rate. So that's the first weakness of the budget, is that there are long time lags for some discretionary policies. Okay, so the second major weakness in the budget is that there is a lack of ability to alter some budget outlays. So the lack of ability to alter budget outlays. So what this means is that sometimes the Treasurer may find it very hard to actually cut the level of pensions or wages of public servants, or to raise personal income tax due to various constraints on contracts, and also due to this impracticality of doing so. So when we have in this business cycle, when we've reached this point of boom, the government tries to cut wage or tries to cut expenditure. And one of the major sources of expenditure is incomes. But since a lot of people have contracts, so we're coming back to this idea that when businesses or when the government implements discretionary policies to encourage businesses to construct more roads, buildings, and transport systems, we will see that they would actually undergo or go under a contract to work for, say, 10 years to construct this road. And when there are excessive aggregate demand conditions, we will see that the government has no choice in slowing growth because of these constraints due to contracts and basic impracticalities of slowing down growth. So that's the second weakness of the budget, is that the lack of ability to alter some budget outlays. Just put some here. Thirdly, there are financial constraints. And so what this means is that during periods of, say, recession, as pointed out by this arrow here, the government may not have enough expenditure or enough revenue in order to stimulate aggregate demand out of recession. And so that's a financial constraint due to the budget options available to the government. Fourthly, we have conflict with monetary policy. And this is a very big one. And we've got a separate lecture and an individual lecture devoted to this. So this conflict with monetary policy, sometimes they become incompatible because of this idea of the crowding in or crowding out effect. So what this suggests is when the government tries to use budgetary policy to stimulate growth, it may actually incur a crowding out effect, which would then increase interest rates, which would then make monetary policy redundant. And the same goes if the budgetary policy wants to slow growth, it would actually cause a crowding in effect and therefore counteract what the use of monetary policy in slowing down growth by implementing a contractionary policy. And we're going to talk about this in further depth in our lecture on the relationship between monetary policy and budgetary policy. So if you want to go to that lecture, it would provide a more in-depth analysis of why there are conflicts between budgetary policy and monetary policy in achieving domestic economic stability. Fifth, we have political constraints. And this is a very subjective one because in some cases, when the government tries or requires greater revenue, they could either increase taxation or they could start borrowing from overseas. But in most cases, they will start to borrow overseas and therefore compromise our external stabilities because they don't want to increase taxes because it is unpopular to the general consensus. So when federal governments want to stay in power, the voter reaction is very important. So when they start to use higher tax rates or to decrease welfare payments to increase their revenue for other sectors, that will prove very unpopular to voters, and therefore they may lose their power in the next election. And this is very important when conducting budgetary policy because sometimes political constraints or political factors may influence the budget. Lastly, we have this idea of psychological constraints. Psychological constraints. And this relates to this prevailing idea of confidence. So what is assumed is that when the government gives out welfare payments, is that people who require welfare payments, they spend it all and they consume all their money. But in reality, sometimes when there is low confidence, people will tend to save their welfare payments. They will start saving for precautionary measures, and even though sometimes when budgetary policy is expansionary, which aims to stimulate growth, sometimes people still don't spend because of these psychological constraints. So when people expect the economy to be in recession for a long time, there would in fact be what is known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. So when people expect the economy to stay in recession for a long time, then they would tend not to spend their income, even though budgetary policy suggests that in times of recession, the budget will move towards an expansionary stance and therefore tax less and give out more stimulus or welfare payments. But in reality, when psychological constraints dictate, even though when people have lower rates of income, they wouldn't spend more, and they'll start saving just because of this prevailing level of low confidence. So sometimes budget surpluses or budget deficits may not actually affect aggregate demand to the extent that theory suggests that it would. So they're the 6 major weaknesses of the budget in achieving domestic economic stability. So firstly, we have time lags. To recap, time lags, the lack of ability to alter some budget outlays, financial constraints, conflict with monetary policy, political constraints, and finally, psychological constraints.